I want to share a little bit of information with you that Arkansas has contributed to, as well as all of the states that lie within the fescue belt. The topic here is improving weight gain for growing cattle grazing fescue. There's a lot of information available with growing cattle on fescue and the impacts of fescue toxicity on growing cattle. Many of us are going to have cow-calf operations. This is applicable on the calf side, but we're really not going to talk about the cow side today. But as we wrap up with some of the other practices that we will discuss as it relates to pasture management, that would be aptly beneficial to the mature cow herd as it would be for growing cattle. There we go. So my presentation, I've got it kind of divided into two parts. The bulk of the presentation is going to focus on one aspect of managing cattle on fescue, and that's going to be the individual animal that we're trying to manage, improve productivity. And then the other aspect is going to be the herd-related aspect, where we're trying to improve overall productivity as we modify the grazing system for cattle. So as we think about some of the animal management factors to consider, this is just a typical cow here at the experiment station exhibiting a common sign of fescue toxicosis, and she's missing most of her tail switch. So if you have fescue pastures, and it really doesn't take much fescue pasture to start causing sloughing of tails, you're understanding or have experienced the negative impacts of fescue toxicosis. I think you know that we've dealt with this problem for so long, we're trying to figure out, well, why hasn't anybody just give us that magic bullet yet? And when we think about the options today, I think there's a really good alternative. It's not really a magic bullet, but it's related to plant management. But in terms of the animal application, maybe the closest thing that we've come to with a magic bullet could be a chemical called domperidone. It works at the cellular level, but right now it's not practical. They use it in the horse industry, but it hasn't developed into a practical application in the cattle industry. And given issues that we're experiencing today with getting things through the FDA and issues with medicated feed additives, we kind of wonder what is going to be the best individual animal approach to come up with a solution that in time will follow up with overall consumer acceptance as well. But if we look at some of the research that's evaluated the use of drugs, those have improved calf weight gain by about 1/2 pound per day. And so a very good response, just not real practical. Who wants to get a calf up every day to give it a shot of a drug to improve weight gain? Our labor is too valuable relative to the performance benefit. So for now, what can be done? And I'm going to share with you just a lot of practical tools that apply aptly to any grazing situation, whether we're talking about toxic fescue or if we're talking about grazing cattle on Bermuda grass pasture. These are just common tools that's available over the counter that's going to improve productivity. Just another telltale sign there. If you wonder if your cattle suffer from fescue toxicosis, if you have fescue pastures and it's not a very hot day outside and they're still gathered up under the trees and have rough hair coats and kind of frothing at the mouth, you've got fescue toxicosis issues going on. I keep wanting to point at the screen instead of the projector. So I think the first thing we have to recognize is do not assume that those technologies that are available to us today are not effective on fescue. We understand and appreciate the negative effects that fescue toxicosis has on weight gain. So we might have the perception that some of the tools, such as growth promoting implants, may not be as effective with cattle on fescue as they might be in other pasture-based situations. And so what we did was we took a look at all of the research that was available in the fescue belt, looking at the effects of implanting growing cattle that are grazing toxic fescue, compared that to non-implanted cattle on fescue, and the implant response of those cattle was a 1/4 pound per day, just slightly under a 1/4 pound per day. Well, that's the exact same type response that we might expect off of cattle grazing wheat pasture or Bermuda grass or other forage types. So there's been a history of seeing where we see cattle benefiting from growth promoting implants. Well, what's the economic benefit? Dr. Richardson kind of opened the door by talking about castration. Well, castration is the first step that we move toward improving the value of our cattle, and then after that, if we've got cattle that aren't destined for a specific market associated with an all-natural type management, if it's just cattle that are going to the sale barn, take advantage of the opportunity to improve weight gain by implanting those cattle. And so if we look at some lightweight cattle based on February market prices and comparing a difference of 20 pounds of weight gain, so instead of selling a 450-pound steer calf due to the implant that was administered at about 90 days of age, and I've gained about 20 pounds of additional weight for market, the return on that is about $21 per head in today's market. Well, implanting is just one of many tools that we can utilize to improve productivity. Here's just a few of the different approaches that researchers have looked at to find ways to enhance performance on fescue. One of those areas for the meta-analysis we conducted was those research projects that looked at antibiotic feed additives. So some of those would be the medically important medicated feed additives, such as chlorotetracycline, but also pulled into that data set is responses to what we're going to call ionophores. It's a special class of antibiotic that doesn't fall under that medicated feed additive rule that's coming next year. And so if we look at the response by providing growing cattle medicated feed additives, we're seeing an improvement over all those research studies of just over 1/10 of a pound per day improvement in performance. Another area that researchers have evaluated is looking at the beneficial effects of deworming. Now, to me, deworming just makes sense. But early on, when we had the Ivomec product really becoming popular in the early 90s, there was a few studies that suggested that maybe the response that we see with cattle on fescue, given that type of product, we're seeing a little extra response in those cattle than what we're seeing above cattle that have been dewormed in a non-toxic fescue environment. Now, if we look at several studies, some done in Arkansas, where those cattle were clean going into that scenario, no worm burden, but they were given the ivermectin product, that response didn't play out. But in general, it naturally makes sense to be deworming our cattle. And with the calves on fescue, they've seen an improvement of about a 1/4 pound per day of weight gain. I think of any of the things that I've discussed so far, probably the thing that's been adopted to the greatest extent is taking care of internal parasites. When we think back to the product I just talked about, using a growth promoting implant, adoption rate, despite the fact that this has been talked about since the early 70s, it still has a really low adoption rate in Arkansas and some other states across the southeast. It was interesting, one of our colleagues, Kenny Simon, who's here with us today, he went into a local co-op store to buy some Ralgrow implants, and they don't even carry them anymore. They said we don't move them off the shelf quick enough. And so we can't afford to just have items sitting on the shelf and not moving. And so there's a lot of missed opportunity in terms of overall weight leaving Arkansas by not utilizing some of these technologies. The third area that has been researched has been associated with what I've classified together as fescue binders. Some of those today we're calling functional foods. They have some super nutritional benefits. And so those would be things like bentonite clays, that are supposed to tie up the toxins that are produced by the fungus and those endophyte infected plants that are producing or got alkaloids. Those are some yeast cell wall extracts, monoligosaccharides, I believe is what they call those. There's within that other products, Tasco product, seaweed type extract that's supposed to help lower body temperatures of cattle, and that has been demonstrated. For example, the Tasco seaweed product, when fed to cattle on endophyte infected fescue, those cattle do exhibit a lower body temperature. But sometimes we can measure a physiological response that doesn't always necessarily transition over into a production response. And so as we look at the cumulative response of these fescue binders, functional foods, of anything that we've really tried to evaluate in research, that has had the lowest level of demonstrated weight gain response. I don't think that's an area we need to give up on in terms of researching, because in terms of consumer adoption of a product, I think something along that functional food category could be a little bit more accepting than maybe a medicated feed additive. So now let's think about the idea of, well, can we get cumulative benefits of applying implants, taking care of internal parasites, maybe adding to that a medicated feed additive delivered through a little bit of supplemental feed or mineral? What might that cumulative benefit be? And so if we look at wiping the screen, it should pick up immediately here in a second. I do have to disclose that we are not promoting Dell products when I pulled that screen up. So the cumulative benefit is about a 0.6 per pound weight gain as an average. If I were to go in and take each of those studies, kind of add the cumulative response to each method together as an average. Now there's going to be variation around that response, but on average across all of the studies, if I thought if each of those components acted individually and independently of one another, and we would have a stacked benefit by adopting each of those, would we see about a 0.6 improvement in weight gain? And if so, what would that be worth? Well, since we're talking about growing cattle and using medicated feed additives and growth implants, back in February, I would see some benefit in terms of value, but you know, on those heavier calves, that price slide really weakened in terms of the added value of weight at that point, but still worth anywhere from $7 to $16 per head by adopting a few simple management practices, two of which are applied easily there at the point of having those cattle in the chute, and then the third one through some feed modification. So what's another approach that we can take? Whether it's with replacement heifers or in this case a lot of work with growing cattle, but some of this research was also collected from creep-fed calves. Creep feeding is one of those areas where most of the times we're going to tell you it's not cost effective, but in the toxic fescue scenario where we're dealing with reduced feed intakes, we can see some benefits with creep feeding that can be more cost effective than what they may not be in some other situations. What each of these different lines represents is a different general type of feedstuff. So this black line is associated with our byproduct feeds, things like corn gluten feed, soybean hulls. Is going to be the bulk of what the studies used on this black line. This red line is associated with a few studies where they looked at an oil type supplemental feed, something like cottonseed or whole cottonseed, where that energy is heavily oil based. The green line here is evaluating the response to more protein type supplementation. So just increasing the protein in the diets of cattle on fescue. And then our blue line here is represented as the average response across all the studies that were using corn or starch-based supplemental feed. Our axis here at the bottom, our x-axis, is associated with the level of supplemental feed intake. And so it ranges generally from just a little less than 0.5% of body weight all the way up to well over 1% of body weight. These studies out here that are over at 1% of body weight, some of those are associated with some creep feed studies where the calves had some free choice access. What I want to point out as we look at all of these studies together is that we see really good responses as our supplementation rate increases. So with growing cattle on fescue, feeding more generally translates over into more weight gain. The other thing I want to point out is that some of our best responses have been associated with the use of these byproduct feedstuffs. And so those are digestible fiber that really complements forage digestion a little bit better. I think also when we start looking at our byproduct feedstuffs, many of those have a contribution of energy as well as a contribution of protein. If we look at our other responses, in general, our response with starch-based supplementation, or primarily these studies are going to be utilizing corn, our weight gain response hasn't been as high as it has been with the byproduct feeds. And so among all of those research studies, it kind of points out two general areas as we look at supplementation. One is that in terms of an extension recommendation, with cattle on toxic fescue, growing cattle on toxic fescue, I'm going to lean more toward supplementing at a higher rate, that 1% of body weight, and I'm doing so because among all those studies, that's where we had really good feed conversions. A higher rate of byproduct feed supplementation, we were observing 5 to 6 pounds of feed for an additional pound of weight gain. Whereas when we look at corn-based supplementation, it was taking almost twice that to get an additional pound of weight gain. We've kind of seen corn go from a $2 market to an $8 market, and now somewhere around that $3.50 market. So if we think of our byproduct feedstuffs, these are generally priced off the value of corn. Corn may appear a little bit cheaper, but our feed conversion tells us we're probably going to make more money using a byproduct type blend with cattle on fescue. So we took that idea of the meta-analysis where researchers have looked at implants independently, medicated feed additives independently, and supplementation independently, and we wanted to take just a general systems approach. And so what is the response that if we say that we're going to demonstrate an improved management system where we put medicated feed additives in combination with growth implants in addition to a 1% body weight supplementation rate, what benefit will we get from that program versus no program at all? And the idea is, are those components really additive or not? Maybe we get a response that exceeds what we might see as an additive benefit, or maybe just the effects of fescue toxins is going to have some masking effects. And so we set this study up in the pastures behind the station here, and half of the pastures we're using have a reduced level of toxicity, and the other half of the pastures have an elevated level of toxicity. So we've got kind of two different levels of toxicity going on in those fields. This represents the weight change of our calves that we started last fall, grew them out over a 91-day period. We started here in October. We ended right after the 1st of January. And so you can see that independent, it didn't matter if we were dealing with low toxicity or high toxicity. The effects of toxicity, whether those pastures had an average of 800 parts per billion ergovaline, or if they were upwards around 2,000 parts per billion ergovaline, where we're seeing twice or 3 times the level of toxins in those fields. Our lowest level of toxicity, which was 800, was enough to really suppress weight gain in those calves. We're going to see the impact of fescue toxicosis on cattle as low as 200 parts per billion. And our low toxicity fields are showing up around 800 parts per billion on average. But independent of level of toxicity, these two lines here represents our improved management. And so over that 91-day period, our calves on improved management were gaining 1.4 pounds per day greater than the calves on the toxic fescue. If I think back to, well, how does that compare to if I went into the research and looked at the distribution of responses and added those responses together along with their distributions, this is kind of where, research tells us that maybe we would see a response, and this would be the average here in the middle. This was the response that we saw in our study. And so it looks like that each of those components definitely have some additive benefit by supplementing, providing implants, plus using a medicated feed additive. The one that we're using in this study is Rumensin. It's an ionophore, and so it's not going to fall within that medically important medicated feed additives. It's going to require a veterinary feed directive after the 1st of next year. If I look at the economic benefit of putting this package together last fall, those calves on average gained 1.4 pounds per day above the non-managed cattle or reduced management cattle. So over a 91-day period, that's 127 pounds of additional weight per calf that I'm available to market now. And the value of gain at that period of time in January, a pound of gain was worth about 86 cents a pound. So that means my total added value was about $109. If I deduct my supplement cost, which we're buying supplement in bulk bags, it's pretty expensive, $215 a ton. So in bulk bag supplementation, that was costing us about $47 per calf over that 91-day period. Our implant cost, we used a more aggressive implant, the component TEG implant. It's a little bit more expensive at just slightly under $2 a calf. And then the addition of adding Rumensin to our mineral was adding $1.68 over that 91-day feeding period. So once I look at my income and deduct my cost, my net benefit was about $58 per calf by implementing this improved management. Yes, sir?
Now, what was your feeding and what age did you implant?
So in this particular project, we started at the point of weaning. And so we're talking about that 7-month-old type calf. We're talking about a 450 pound kind of start weight. We implanted at the day of weaning with those calves. They had already been castrated at a much younger age. And so we didn't have to worry about any reduced responses due to castration in this study. And then the Rumensin, we're buying it in the mineral, but since we're putting feed in a trough, to guarantee that we're going to get a better uptake of that mineral plus the Rumensin by the cattle, we're top dressing that mineral with Rumensin every day that we feed. Our control group has the same mineral without the Rumensin, just as a free choice access. So if you think about it, just common production management tools available generally over the counter that in our system provided a 1.4, almost 1.5 pound per day benefit to our animal management. The additional consideration that we can put into place would be pasture management options. So as we kind of wrap up here and consider a few of the pasture management things that we might consider, there's been a number of studies conducted at this research station that's been discussed in the past. We're talking about the addition of legumes or clovers into that fescue stand to help reduce fescue toxins, help provide some benefits of selectively grazing, a higher quality part of the pasture canopy compared to fescue. So there's various benefits to the legumes into that system. You know, probably the one benefit that you really want to capture is the nitrogen fixation in addition to the animal performance to help those fescue plants around it. If we look at the different studies with the weight gain response on clovers, clovers provide very little benefit in the fall. And if you think about it, it kind of makes sense. Our falls can be pretty dry. The clovers at that time aren't very productive. And so our fall benefit in the research that's looked at clovers has shown very little benefit with weight gain response. But when we compare and look at the benefit we see in spring or late spring, early summertime, that's where we see the benefits of clovers really kick in. And that's where the clovers are really productive. And so clovers is something that we ought to continue to consider as an additional management tool to stack on the technologies that I've already discussed. And this is one of the management practices that would benefit the cow as well as the calf. If we look at average daily gain response among individual calves, it's about 1/4 pound improvement in weight gain. And that's across 26 studies. So I'm not talking about one study at Batesville where we saw 1/4 pound improvement. I'm talking about 26 studies in the fescue belt where the average response was 1/4 pound improvement in weight gain. Of recent, you may have seen in popular press the use of metsulfuron or a herbicide to suppress seedhead development in fescue. This one here, I think we're kind of treading on some dangerous ground, but it has shown some positive benefits. There's some case study work out of Dow that with Circle A ranches that shows a really good improvement in pregnancy rates with the mature cow herds that they had on treated pastures. This is with weight gain responses among 7 studies using seedhead suppression, almost a 4/10 improvement in weight gain. Very, very positive. It's tough to keep clovers in pastures in terms of how we manage pastures. So if there's a method that we could go in and spray a pasture, do some suppression, and enhance performance this much, I think it's very interesting to continue to look into. Now with that said, I would say visit with Dr. Jennings, your county agent, before you just go out and apply metsulfuron to implement a seedhead suppression protocol, simply from the perspective that when you apply that product, not only are you going to suppress seed heads, you're going to suppress fescue plant stands. And so you're going to have less amount of available forage out there when you apply this type of a product. Depending upon your stocking rate, it may not matter. The other aspect of what's going to fill in the gaps when you do that suppression. Now the thing with these studies, when you're looking at studies in Missouri, over in Kentucky where they've done quite a few of this, well, they have some other pretty decent cool season grasses like Kentucky bluegrass that has kind of come in and filled in that void associated with the reduction in the canopy attributed to suppression of the fescue. And so with some of this response, it could be associated with changing the composition of forage species in your field. Now, if you don't have those other good cool season grasses out there and you spray this, you cause a big suppression, what you may end up doing is no benefit at all. And that's been demonstrated too, where excessive suppression, you end up with no better response than what you would have got if you'd have just left the fescue alone. And so timing of application and response to changing species composition, is something that I think needs to be evaluated further before you just go out and adopt this haphazardly. But very good responses. How good of a response is it? Dr. Aiken over in Kentucky accidentally applied this technology not to toxic fescue, but to non-toxic fescue. So they accidentally planted endophyte-free fescue as the stand instead of K31 toxic fescue, and they saw that benefit show up in that endophyte-free system. And so it kind of goes back to when you start suppressing reproductive development, it may be a change in the quality of the composition of the pasture out there. You start thinking about leaf to stem ratio and leaves being greater quality than seed heads. And so I think it's a very interesting concept. It's been around a long time. It's been around since the late 70s, early 80s with another product called mefluidide, but that product was never approved. These products actually have some approval for seed head suppression. And then we've got the idea of the novels. There's been research here conducted at the station comparing growing cattle on a endophyte infected non-toxic fescue compared to the old K31 toxic fescue. And so I kind of throw this as a kind of a separate category because we're not really enhancing the system. We're wiping the old system out and replacing it with something new. And maybe that's a concept we need to develop. Maybe we need to get past the idea of if we've got growing cattle, in some situations, the most cost-effective thing for us to do would be to start converting some of those performance-suppressing toxic fescue stands and replacing them with a new system of endophyte infected non-toxic fescues. If we look at the research studies, as I hit the wrong button and promote Dale one more time. 16 studies have shown about 170 pound per acre increase in weight produced off of the novel fescue compared to the toxic Kentucky 31 systems. 25 studies, if we look at individual animal response, have shown about a 0.6 pound per day increase in average daily gain. Okay, so now start putting that whole concept together. We have a novel system that's going to give us a 0.6 improvement in weight gain. Now we put a medicated feed additive into that system plus a growth implant into that system, clean those calves of internal parasites. How much weight can we produce per acre in a well-managed enhanced production system? So it's just kind of as a concluding statement, sometimes when I think of just dealing with fescue, it's something that many of us are kind of tired of dealing with. But we have to appreciate fescue, even the endophyte infected fescue, for how we can still utilize it effectively in stockpiled systems if we use it at the right times of years, and we can dilute that out at the summer time of year or more critical times of year, which is a whole different other subject that we don't have time to discuss. But the concept is all is not lost. If we're dealing with fescue, don't let that keep you from just adopting good, sound, cost-effective management practices and take advantage of the additional weight you can take to market with implants, ionophores, deworming, and supplementation. And then when we start thinking about developing a plan to converting toxic fields over to non-toxic fields, one area to consider is which of those pastures do cattle exhibit the worst response. In that study we conducted last fall, one of our toxic fescue fields, those calves gained almost 0 pounds over 91 days. I think they gained like 7 pounds. So that's pretty close to 0. So if I was thinking about what field I might want to convert, I might want to start with that one, the one that is the most toxic. And how can we identify that field? There's different tests available for identifying the level of toxicity in a fescue field. We can do fescue ergot prevalence in a field, as well as alkaloid testing if you're looking at evaluating fields for level of toxicity and identifying a threshold of which fields to replace first.